standing in back of the Brooklyn Daily Eagle building, or what was once the Brooklyn Daily Eagle building, where Walt Whitman served as editor in the late 1840s until he was fired. But the Brooklyn Daily Eagle building is really the place to begin to describe the career of Walt Whitman. Not that that career hadn't begun earlier. If we were to walk back 3 or 4 blocks, we would eventually reach the site of that small print shop where Whitman eventually would set by hand himself the type for the first Leaves of Grass. Set it in a local print shop, one he knew well from his having come of age in Brooklyn. I'd never thought about the, sort of the idea of authorship, that sense we have of the author as this monolithic creator of a document is in fact false, since books, type, covers, binding, right? There's a kind of democratic community that all joins together in order to make anything, and that in the production of this book, and not only the reception of this book, there is that community working together.
And I think Walt also liked the idea of controlling the whole thing himself, right? Because he wrote the poetry, he helped print the poetry, he designed the book, he distributed the book. He lived in that
intimacy.
Yeah, and I mean, everything about it is a DIY thing. And I think he still lived during that time right before everything becomes mechanized and it becomes really much harder to sort of like maintain control of your whole artistic product. Walt took to the printing business, as we now know. So being in this printing shop, it just feels right. This is where he started, in essence, as a poet. It's the beginnings of his love of language, I feel like. And you're going to show us today a little bit about like how he would have typeset something, right? Like on a basic level.
Set type letter for letter and line by line in this called a composing stick. So this is wood type, and type, as you might remember, is backwards and upside down when you're setting it. So Walt Whitman here in a composing stick. So it has an adjustable elbow and slides back and forth. So depending on the line length, of course there would be a space here. This is called furniture, and this is what you would put between the letters. So you'd have 1 or 2 depending on what width you wanted. So each drawer is a different typeface. And on the right-hand side are capitals, and then on the left-hand side are lowercase letters. And at one time, when you're setting type, you would have used an uppercase and a lowercase, and the capitals would be set on the top case, and the minuscules or the lowercase letters would be here. And that's literally why we call letters uppercase and lowercase. So I thought you might like to see a font of type.
Yes.
And see how type arrives. And if you want to hold it.
I do.
So that's made of a combination of metal, antimony, which is mostly lead, but other metals mixed in. And so when you get a font of type, it would arrive like this with a proof on the top to show you which font of type it is. So this printing press, patented in 1901, is manually operated by pumping with the foot. So my one leg is much bigger 19 years later than my other leg. It also has more hair on the right.
Really?
Because
so they're decidedly different. So printers are very asymmetric in their form. This is a rotating inking disc, and the ink is applied with an inking knife. This is ink, so you can see. So you can see the consistency.
Yeah.
It's like the consistency of tar. So you apply it here, and you'll notice as I pump, the disc rotates. So it's a rotating ink disc. So it turns counterclockwise, and the ink then is distributed across the roller. I just thought to do a facsimile of what the opening page would look like. So the image of Whitman, the typeset here, Brooklyn, New York, the period.
He used such abnormally big type for that title page.
And he used 3 different typefaces.
Oh.
And usually in a book you have a very standard look, especially in the 19th century, but I think he was using job type for this, right? So even stepping outside of the idea of book publishing. He's going into the advertising world, so Walt,
That's a good
right?
point,
So pop.
yes.
And it goes along with, you know, the fact that the frontispiece picture is not just a headshot like it always is, but it's
Oh,
a
it's a
full
full
body shot,
body.
because it's the body of this poet that's going into the work. It's not just the brain.
Absolutely.
So
And there's a kind of encounter with him as a body that is being invited. But I had never before known anything about the asymmetry of his hip alignment, and now
I didn't
thinking
even
of
think
him
with the
as
printer.
having,
Robert.
It's
having
very jaunty too, the
it's
pose.
very. Oh, I've always thought of it as very inviting and jaunty and a little sexy, but I had never
The
thought
lean.
of the slouch as a printer's.
And going back to
asymmetry.
his like problems with the right side of his body, from the eye to his stroke, you know, maybe originating in a favoring of one side of his body as the printing trade would do.
If I haven't printed in a few days, it feels so good to come back to it, because it's like dancing with a bear. You know, it's this big
This
machine.
machine.
And if you need to stop it, you can stop it. But to have a machine that's basically
And
the
it's
same
actually the
size.
same size as you are,
Yeah.
right? But a lot heavier.
Yes, I hope so. Yes.
For Walt, this was all important, all the senses, you know, and the sensory experience of printing, right? And the fact that, just like phrenology, you are who you become the thing that you do,
That's
right? Like with phrenology, how you are on the outside is how you are on the inside. In the shop, what you do becomes the way that you are all the time, right?
That's beautifully said.
Well, thank you.
So here we are on Nassau Street.
Heart of Whitman Central, I feel like. You know,
Yeah,
there's so much
Whitman
going
Central.
on here.
So what is going on here?
Well, a little bit further up, and the building doesn't exist anymore, but it used to be at 131 Nassau Street. That was Fowler and Wells's phrenological cabinet. In the cabinet, they conducted phrenological readings. And phrenology is one of these pseudosciences that's starting to simmer in the 1840s, an alternative to sort of different ways about thinking about your life
It's a
and
kind
your
of
psychology.
psychiatry.
Head bumps, right?
Okay,
So.
yeah, I would feel your head.
And if I had a bump somewhere, there was a chart that said, oh my gosh, you're smart, or you're more amative. You know, there was a whole vocabulary
Right.
that Whitman really loved about these
Anxiety,
exams.
Yes.
And Whitman had his bumps read in the late 1840s, was so fond of his chart that he included it in the 1856 edition of Leaves of Grass.
I did not know that.
So this phrenology that was happening at Fowler and Wells was a really key part of the way he started developing his ideas of psychology.
To have that analytic grid that tells you about yourself in a way provides a bit of a little checklist, you know, about the possible components.
You're
of the
so
self.
right. This is it's an alternative not just to science but to faith, to religion, right?
Yes.
Like, how do I put myself in the world? How do I consider myself?
That's right. So we're also here at the center of what would have been newspaper culture in the 1840s. What were the papers he worked on?
Well, we could start with the Aurora, but he was not there long. He was fired around May. Some of the Aurora staff later wrote he was a slacker, that he would show up at work at 10 or 11, take a lunch break, ride the omnibus up and down Broadway, and maybe do something later. So lots of temptation, as we've seen
Lots and
in this
lots of
area, to do
temptation.
things.
And also, a city is a place where work and leisure, we have someone running by, right? It's the middle of a work day. It's a place where work and leisure are riveting, right? Interpenetrating, interimplicated all the time.
This is such a good point about being urban, right? For a lot of urbanites, you don't need a destination. The journey through the streets is the destination, right?
Yes.
So you let things happen to you because things
Yeah.
are always happening.
And Whitman was always interested in convening places. Sometimes all attentive to one thing, as in a parade where all eyes, all hearts in some way focus and beat together, and sometimes milling around a place, each person with his own purpose.
Right. What people really don't know about him was that he had a Shakespearean background. The park had great Shakespearean actors. Junius Brutus Booth was Walt's absolute favorite. So Whitman would go to the Park Theater and just hear Booth do these recitations. It influenced the way Whitman thought about poetry, being an oral, listener up there. He's talking always in the poetry.
Also the experience of a live performance in which there's an intimacy and a kind of contact that
Right.
one feels. That experience is one Whitman knows that print does not afford precisely, but he tries as hard as he can.
Right.
When he writes, "Stop this day and night with me, and you shall
That's
know
right.
the meaning of all poems." He's suggesting that poetry can have some of that charged intimacy that we get in the theater, and also telling us, I think, in very early in Song of Myself, that his relationship to us is not necessarily going to be the relationship of two people in absolutely human scale, but he will have that kind of large presence that someone on a stage has and that we tolerate.
You
right?
said it so beautifully, and I feel like that's why we love him, right?
That's why we
He's
love
a poet who refuses to stay on the page.
Karen has just brought us to a very dark alley, a very dark, unsightly.
We have to go to a dark alley with Walt Whitman.
Unsightly alley. Karen, tell us why we're here.
Okay, well, this is the old theater alley, and a lot of people have in their mind that New York City is full of these dark, dank,
Yeah.
scary alleys, when in fact they're very rare. We don't have a lot of
Right.
space for these
That's
alleys.
right.
And this is one of the few remaining alleys. This would be the back of the Park Theater. So a little bit further down, because the Park Theater is kind of in the middle of this block, that's where the actors would exit, the prostitutes, the cheap seats people. So Walt would traditionally come through here
right down
and
here.
then perhaps walk down here on his way back to Brooklyn from seeing a show. So this was a space that he knew. And as a man who wrote about the fringes of culture, this is the beginnings in 1842, when he's still 23 and still thinking about things, the beginnings of thinking about fairness, right? Like even with the actors, the actresses, and being an actress back then is also not
It's
a
one
hugely
step-
great thing.
Right. It's often one step from a prostitute, and often one goes back and forth between the different
Right.
roles.
So later in life, he would actually commune with these people at a place called Foff's up further on Broadway. But back here, it's the beginnings of him beginning to mingle with these different populations.
One of the things we see in the middle of the 19th century is the artist trying to have a professional career in the city, often having to work at some other profession.
Right.
Journalism, still barely making ends meet. And it's during this period that our romantic image of the starving artist, the starving urban artist living in a garret,
Right.
really does take hold.
And of course, you're evoking bohemianism here.
That's right.
And
that's,
Foff's was actually the first bohemian bar in America.
That's right.
It was New York's gathering place, opening around 1856. And the guy who founded it, Henry Clapp, had been to Paris, to the Left Bank.
That's right.
Had an idea of a sort of like an artistic coterie. He hadn't seen it in New York. There were bits and pieces floating around, as we get the
Yes.
feeling of here,
Yes.
but there was no gathering hole.
You're also describing this, the way in which an artistic culture, an
Right.
intellectual culture, what we would call a bohemian culture, is developing, one in which a kind of artistic life we take for granted now really is developing. One where artists of different disciplines
Right.
also begin to cross-fertilize and influence
And this
each
was-
other's lives. So actresses, journalists, poets, opera
Painters.
singers, painters, all coming together. And while we now take for granted that to be a New York artist is in some ways to be inter-artistic and to
Right.
be borrowing, that really does take hold and find one of its first institutions in Foff's. In picking poems for us to read, I chose not only poems exercised by suffering, but some poems that just talk about, well, the sort of what happens before the suffering, poems that that rest in a way in moments of war in which there isn't really suffering. And so if we just look at these poems, Cavalry Crossing a Ford, and 1861, and why don't we start with 1861, since that is where things started. And maybe I would just throw out the question, what does it mean to title a poem 1861, and to make a year a kind of character?
Well, in a sense, it's to pluck it out of the stream of time. To not think of history as a progression ever marching forward, but to take this one moment. And in a way that's very artificial, to say that this one moment has this vast import that's not just what came before or what came after, but something that changed in that very instant.
I know what you mean. It is as though Whitman looks at generic time, right? Or as though the world runs on a kind of generic time, and yet there are these moments in time where these moments that are inflection points, right? And he seems, if I understand you, John, and maybe to press this a little further, he seems to be suggesting that nationhood, right? That nationhood in some way needs to organize itself by choosing particular moments, right? Particular years that have an extra sort of resonance, right? And I think of, when we say 1941, when we say 1776, when we say 9/11, those numbers begin to organize all of disorganized time for us. So.
I was going to say that's what the title does for me, but then the verse seems to try to do something different, or isn't quite sure how to do that, how to pluck a moment out of time. And Whitman seems to adopt a strategy that he adopts elsewhere, which is to focus on the body. When he starts to personify the year, not you as some pale poetling seated at a desk lisping cadenzas piano, but as a strong man, erect, clothed in blue clothes, advancing, carrying a rifle on your shoulder, with well-gristled body and sunburned face and hands, with a knife in the belt at your side, as I heard you shouting loud, your sonorous voice ringing across the continent. Who else would address a figure of time as someone with a well-gristled body? It's extraordinary. And the only figures of time poetry generally accesses are old figures with white beards. But for Whitman, we get a well-gristled body with a sunburned face and hands. These details of the physical. It's as though he's trying to grasp this moment in time, but to give it physical being in a strange way.
And what's the effect of that physical being?
I'm going to back up a little bit and not answer that question. The sort of act of compression of making this poem about a single year, trying to embody it in some way. Seeing these two poems together, they both seem to take on this challenge of compressing things in a way that poetry doesn't normally compress them. So I guess I'm circling back around now to what you were talking about, Seth, in terms of finding a way to embody time that isn't white-bearded father time. But Cavalry Crossing the Ford does that act of compression in the way a painting would. So it's a poem kind of describing a painting, or the catalog trying to set endpoints of January 1st and December 31st, which seems an artificial way of compressing a Whitmanian catalog, or the way that 1861 tries to move across space, even though it's a poem of time. Poems that are trying to compress or to summarize in ways that are actually quite difficult to do. There is this sense of experience that's very difficult to put on the page.
It's so interesting that you say compress, since I think that 1861 is supposed to epitomize and in that way compress or to crystallize or to gather in something. And at the same time, as you point out, the poem, in the poem, 1861, is a man walking across it's many men walking across the continent, spread out all over this geography.
I mean, several of you use the word embody, to put time in bodies, and this is, in my view, part of Whitman's democratic project. This is 1861 is the people here, isn't it?
Mhm.
It's turning it over to what I think he celebrates in so many of his poems, the mass, the common people who are men who will be fighting this war. And so he sort of gives the year over to that
And
demos
if I
in a
under-
sense.
That's
of
right, to the
yeah.
working man,
Yeah.
and out
Yeah.
of, right, instead of the American, instead of the poetling in his study representing that democratic body.
Yeah,
It's
and that's
instead.
who the war will be fought by and for.
There's also, I think, a fascinating, less literal spin on that, because he does say, amid the men of Manhattan, I saw you, as one of the workmen, the dwellers in Manhattan, or with large steps crossing the prairies out of Illinois and Indiana. And he goes on with this whole catalog of places, and you could say it's places where people who are embodying the spirit of 1861, this democratic spirit, have been seen. You can also think of it literally as the year itself spreading throughout the American states and territories. And it's fascinating to think that time here has not only been plucked out of that regular stream of time, but has been placed so firmly and concretely within the parentheses of geography.
And what is that? That could mean a number of things. The first thing I heard when you said that, you said it so beautifully, was the way in which a kind of sense of the significance of the year spreads all over the nation, right, and unifies as a newspaper will unify. But that isn't exactly, I think, what you had in mind.
I think it's intimately related. I think it's one side of the coin.
Do we find this poem jingoistic or propagandistic or?
It seems to me to have a pretty clear political aim, by associating 1861 with the Union, clothed in blue clothes, and then going on to list all these places, some of which are in the Union and some of which are not. To me, that did seem very jingoistic, very much associating the Union with time and nation in a larger way.
And trying by a kind of fiat, by a kind of verbal fiat, to create a union of all the states when such union is being contested.
Song of myself. I celebrate myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. Houses and rooms are full of perfumes. The shelves are crowded with perfumes. I breathe the fragrance myself and know it and like it. The distillation would intoxicate me also, but I shall not let it. The atmosphere is not a perfume. It has no taste of the distillation. It is odorless. It is for my mouth forever. I am in love with it. I will go to the bank by the wood and become undisguised and naked. I am mad for it to be in contact with me. The smoke of my own breath echoes, ripples, and buzzed whispers, love root, silk thread, crotch, and vine, my respiration and inspiration, the beating of my heart, the passing of blood and air through my lungs, the sniff of green leaves and dry leaves, and of the shore and dark-colored sea rocks, and of hay in the barn, the sound of the belched words of my voice, words loosed to the eddies of the wind, a few light kisses, a few embraces, a reaching around of arms, the play of shine and shade on the trees as the supple boughs wag, the delight alone, or in the rush of the streets, or along the fields and hillsides, the feeling of health, the full noon trill, the song of me rising from bed and meeting the sun. Have you reckoned 1,000 acres much? Have you reckoned the earth much? Have you practiced so long to learn to read? Have you felt so proud to get at the meaning of poems? Stop this day and night with me, and you shall possess the origin of all poems. You shall possess the good of the earth and sun. There are millions of suns left. You shall no longer take things at second or third hand, nor look through the eyes of the dead, nor feed on the specters in books. You shall not look through my eyes either, nor take things from me. You shall listen to all sides and filter them for yourself.
We would be remiss not to notice how commercial, right, or how deliberate the physical form of this book is. Emerson wrote this letter to Whitman, and Whitman promptly, bound it into the copies he had on hand of Leaves of Grass. Whitman was selling Leaves of Grass. He was, yes, buying advertising space to advertise it in newspapers. He was writing reviews of it himself, on lots of reviews of it himself. He was selling it, Leaves of Grass, not in the bookshops where Longfellow and James Russell Lowell and Oliver Wendell Holmes and and William Cullen Bryant, the three namers, right? He was selling it not in the bookshops where such works ordinarily would be sold, and where one would open the book and there would be a lovely image of the writer, and he'd be standing in front of his bookshelves, and he'd be wearing a cravat, and his beard would be glossy, and he'd look scholarly, and as though just any contact with him would be improving. Whitman was not selling books in that way. He was instead hawking them. They were in a great big pile. Here's his distributor, Fowler and Wells Phrenology Parlor. As you're on your way out, you might just pick up a copy of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, just to add another commercial element. And it's for me, it's wonderful to think both about Walt Whitman as he was a man of the 1850s, right, of his own cultural moment, actually trying to sort of make his mark in the TV guide rung of culture. Whitman looked around at the competitors. If anyone's ever done a book proposal, you write, your editor says, well, what are the competing texts? Whitman was looking around at books that were doing well, and one of the books that was doing well was a book written by Sarah Willis Parton. Sarah Willis Parton lived right across the river in Brighton, and she went by the pseudonym Fanny Fern. And she was really doing well with this book called Fern Leaves from Fanny's Portfolio. The cover of Fern Leaves from Fanny's Portfolio is really very, very close to the cover of Whitman's Leaves of Grass. If it worked for Fanny, it was enough. It was enough for Walt.